Okay, do you think we're ready to go, Stephen?
Yeah, I think so. If you're with us, congratulations for being on time. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's event on genital cutting and children's rights, to launch and to discuss a new report from the International NGO Council on Genital Autonomy. So my name is Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the UK National Secular Society. I should probably point out that the NGO Council on Genital Autonomy and the report itself is actually independent of the NSS, but it is a project that we've supported. And indeed, one of the authors of the report, Dr. Anthony Lempert, who joins us tonight, is also the chair of our Secular Medical Forum. So here at the NSS, the National Secular Society, we advocate for secularism. By that, I mean an end to religious privilege, the separation between religion and state, to basically achieve equal respect for everyone's human rights, so no one's either advantaged or disadvantaged on account of their beliefs, or indeed anyone else's beliefs. So we want to ensure that nobody else's religion or cultural practices restricts anyone else's freedoms or negatively impacts upon the lives of others. And that really is what brings the issue of genital cutting within our remit, because while we wholly support the principle of freedom of religion or belief, we also recognize the need to balance freedoms fairly and, where necessary, restrict religious freedom where the manifestation of a religion causes harm or in any way infringes on other people's rights. And over the years, it's become increasingly clear to me that the cutting of a child's genitals without any therapeutic necessity or benefit really does represent a pretty clear breach of a child's bodily integrity, something we readily recognize for girls, but with boys, not so much. And I think this excellent new report is essentially a plea to better respect and to protect all children's rights and freedoms in this area. So I'm very much looking forward to the report's authors setting out their case this evening. Before I do, I just want to mention that the National Secular Society is a membership organisation. All of our work is funded by our members and our supporters. So if you do support the work we do and you're not a member, please do join us. Become a member so we can continue to work on this and many other important issues. Okay, so without any further ado, please let me hand you over to Megan Manson, who's our head of campaigns at the National Secular Society. She's going to introduce our guests for this evening. She's going to be your host for this evening's event, which I really hope you all enjoy. So thank you, and over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk. Before I hand you over to our speakers, I'd just like to let you know that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom at any time. And in the latter half of the event, we'll select as many of the questions as we can within the time allowed for our panelists to answer. This event is being recorded and the video will be published later. You may have also noticed, as well of our speakers, we have Helen Nichols in the meeting. She's our head of operations and she's handling the technical side of tonight's event. So thank you very much, Helen. So now on to our speakers, both of whom are members of the International NGO Council on Genital Autonomy and are the authors or two of the authors of the report, Protecting All Children, Affirming the Right to Genital Autonomy of Every Child. You can view this report via our website, www.secularism.org.uk. So from the UK, we have Dr. Anthony Lempert, who is the chair of the National Secular Society's Secular Medical Forum, which works to protect patients from the harm caused by the imposition of other people's personal beliefs. Anthony is a partner in a rural GP practice and chairs the Shropshire division of the British Medical Association. And joining us all the way from Vancouver Island in Canada, we have Kira Antinuk, who is a medical adjudication consultant for the federal government. She also serves as the Executive Director of the Children's Health and Human Rights Partnership, which is a non-profit organisation of professionals in the fields of medicine, ethics and law, who are committed to ending non-therapeutic genital cutting on children in Canada. So first, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us tonight, and congratulations on the report. I've read it. I thought it was an excellent summary, a very comprehensive summary of the issues surrounding genital cutting. It's very accessible as well to those who might not necessarily know about these issues and it's the first time they've come across them. So first, can you tell us about why the NGO Council on Genital Autonomy was formed, and what purpose does the council and the report seek to address?
Okay, well, I'll kick off. Thanks ever so much, Megan, and thank you for hosting this event, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really much appreciated. Well, all over the world and for many centuries, adults with strong religious or cultural beliefs have felt that it's important to them to mark their children's bodies, and quite often that involves ritual genital cutting. And whilst these practices will vary quite significantly in terms of who's cut and what the effects are, they all share some common features, and they all, every time a child's genitals are cut for no medical reason, it violates the child's right to bodily integrity. The child, nearly always in these cases, is far too young to consent to the procedure, far too young to resist or object, and we have no idea what the child's later beliefs are going to be. So they may well share their parents' perspectives, but equally they may well have very different views to their parents. And what we notice is over the past 50 years, and particularly over the past 30 years, when the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's been a new lens on practices, and the lens focuses on in terms of the harm caused to children, our new understanding and developing understanding, safeguarding children, even sometimes and sometimes especially from harm caused within their own community. And it's interesting when you think about the convention. It's remarkable that all right, we'll put the United States to one side for a second, but every other country in the world has signed up to a universal set of principles, and that speaks to the universality of these principles. And all traditional genital cutting practices, on the face of it, reach quite a lot of these principles. The right of a child to have to form their own views, to express their own beliefs, to be protected from all forms of violence, and to be protected from harmful traditional practices prejudicial to their health. I mean, there are others. And even at Article 2 of the Convention, it explicitly states that this affects every single child. Every child is an individual, no matter who they are, where they're born, what their parents believe. It's irrelevant. So there should be no gender distinction in terms of protection or distinction in terms of parental belief. And what we're finding is that over the past few years, there's been quite a lot of focus, particularly on the genital cutting of biologically female children, which is widely regarded in the developed world, at least, as a crime of sexual violence against girls and women, and commonly called female genital mutilation. And interestingly, over the recent years, there's been increasing awareness of the rights of intersex children, intersex people. That's people whose bodies don't neatly fit into the binary male-female. They have differences of sexual development. And even the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture recognised intersex genital cutting as a potential human rights violation. And so it's difficult to understand initially the widespread indifference to towards the plight of biologically male boys, who worldwide are more commonly cut than biologically female children, and particularly boys from who are brought up in Jewish, Muslim, and sometimes North African communities, and the United States, where it's widespread as well. Because there is no country in the world that offers explicit protection to boys from routine or ritual genital cutting. And if I may, I'll just give a little bit of background on the formation of INGOTCA, our organisation itself, because I think it's some interesting developments. And back 10 years ago now, in May 2012, there was an historic court case in Cologne. And it was historic because it was the first conviction of somebody for ritual circumcision. And the person wasn't convicted because a problem had happened, although it had. It was a 4-year-old child with Muslim parents in Germany, but he was convicted on the basis that the child was healthy, the child had the right to expect to be protected from harm, and the parents didn't have the right to consent on the child's behalf. And this caused, you may imagine, this caused quite a stir in Germany at the time, and public debate, with Angela Merkel weighing in, and certainly within 6 months, Angela Merkel had ensured that there was new legislation, new de facto legislation that allowed religious adults, in particular, legal permission to cut children under 6 months old, which protected, which sort of recovered the rights, or the claimed rights of Jewish adults to cut at 8 days old. Now, at the time, several of us tried.
Sorry, Anthony, you're experiencing technical difficulties, I think. There's some connection ones. So what I'm going to do is move on to our next question. I think you've covered most of that anyway. So I'm going to move on to our next question, which hopefully Kira can answer. Just going on to what Anthony was talking about with the different approach between male and female genital cutting. So what's often called FGM, female genital mutilation, and male circumcision. The most common argument we hear for the different approaches to male and female genital cutting in law is that FGM is more egregious than male circumcision, and so it justifies different legal treatment. How would you address this point?
Yeah, that's a common one that we hear as well. And I hope, speaking of hearing, that everyone can hear me okay. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me. What I would say is that you're right, concerns have been raised that efforts to place male and female genital cutting into the same context will ultimately weaken efforts to eradicate female genital cutting. The problem with that, I think, is that when we condemn female genital cutting without also challenging male genital cutting, what we're doing is we're really reinforcing sexist attitudes about our bodies. We're essentially saying that male bodies are resistant to harm, perhaps even in need of testing through painful ordeals. But then when we're silent about intersex genital cutting, for example, we're saying that intersex bodies are abnormal and in need of alteration. So when we only take a firm stand about female genital cutting, what we're doing is we're perpetuating the idea that vulnerability is gendered. And I think the other really major oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to come in for just a quick explanation for some of the people here, what you mean by intersex, exactly.
Yeah, so Anthony kind of mentioned a little bit about it. So children that are deemed intersex are born with genitalia that it used to be referred in the literature as ambiguous genitalia. And so there is no, measurement about what size a clitoris should be or what size a penis should be. That really isn't a thing. We know that now. But it had been, even recently, children were having their genitals operated on at a very young age to fit some surgeon's idea of what normal genitals should look like. And so these children were growing up and discovering, what had been done to them, and increasingly becoming very upset that these decisions were made without their consent, and often not just one surgery, but potentially a series of surgeries over years. And often with pretty serious repercussions on their sexual function. I have to be quite honest about that. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of the intersex piece. But when we step back and look at the big picture, when we only take a firm stand about female genital cutting and we focus only on eradicating that, which is typically done quite a bit in other countries, non-Western countries. Meanwhile, we're turning a blind eye to the male genital cutting and intersex genital alteration that's going on right, in our backyards. What we're doing is we're really reinforcing notions of cultural superiority. And I think that will ultimately weaken all efforts to end female genital cutting.
Thanks. So The other argument that we do hear is that, unlike male circumcision, which is, we know has strong connections with religion, the FGM, female genital cutting, has nothing to do with religion. And again, this is the reason why it should be treated differently. It becomes a freedom of religion argument. What would you say to that?
I don't know if we've got Anthony still back with us. Anthony, did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. I'm sorry, I seem to be cutting in and out a little bit. Well, I mean, that's an interesting question because I suppose the first question was a thought experiment. If FGM is widely regarded as a religious requirement, would that justify it? Would the world suddenly go, oh gosh, we got it all wrong, no problem, we can let that continue now? And I think the simple answer is that, and I think the general movement is that it would be very hard to justify that. It would be very, very difficult to see that happening. In practice, there is a religious sect that practices FGM on a religious basis, the Dawoodi Bohra sect of Islam, and there was a very interesting legal case on this in America only I think it's 2 or 3 years ago. I won't go into the great details, but it actually ended up because the prosecutors tried to use gender discrimination to prosecute the doctor who performed FGM. The case fell because there is no gender discrimination when you're cutting boys and girls, and I think that's a really interesting point. And also, if I may just add in, I just wanted to add something into the earlier bit about the earlier question about whether FGM is more egregious or not. Well, many of us, I mean, the reality is that it's not a harm comparison. There are many different harms, but more than that, here in the UK, no less a person than the former president of the Family Division of the High Court of England and Wales, Sir James Mumby himself, in a case in 2015, noted that some forms of FGM are less severe than the usual forms of male circumcision. Sorry, my video just keeps cutting out. And he described them all as constituting significant harm under the term of the Children Act. And I think that's really important because it puts it where it is. It is a harm, and we shouldn't be comparing one with another. And I think it's also important to note that we don't really know the depth of harms that happen to boys or girls. To be fair, I mean, I think we just, who's monitoring it? These things are often done in homes, all types of ritual genital cutting. And certainly in the UK, there is very limited monitoring. There's no formal system for monitoring, and the only information we have is from freedom of information searches and certain newspaper articles. We know there have been deaths from this, and there's sometimes one of them quite awfully was described as a tragic unforeseen accident of a very healthy boy who was whose genitals were cut. So I think it's not fair to say that we're not here trying to compare the two. I think it's really important that we're not focusing on any one practice. From our perspective as in Duncker, the first cut into the body, that's the problem. It's a child's healthy body. That's where the problem lies. And from a child safeguarding perspective, that's always our focus. We focus on the child in front of us.
I thought I might just add in a little point too, Anthony. We're talking about how do we tackle these issues? How do we work on this? How do we eradicate all forms? It sort of struck me that there isn't actually any culture in the world that practices female genital cutting that doesn't also practice the male genital cutting of young boys as well. So this legitimizes these childhood genital cutting practices overall, and it really makes it much harder to make any sort of a case against female genital cutting at all, because in those cultures, they see them as parallel rites of passage for children. So I really feel like we need to highlight that we can't tackle one without also addressing the other.
Absolutely right. I just wanted to go back to sort of the religious aspects of this. So I know that religious Jews in particular will argue that circumcision is, the most ancient ritual in Judaism, and it's fundamental to Jewish identity. So what would you say in response to arguments that restricting male circumcision is an assault on that identity?
Well, if I may, I'll come in on that, because I think the principle of religious freedom is fundamental here, and I think we cherish that, as does the National Secular Society, and that's the point really. It's the child's right to express their own religious beliefs, and what's happening is that people are using some of the conventions and selecting little bits of them to satisfy what they believe is a permission to cut their child's genitals. In particular, they have parents. Of course, parents have the right to help direct their child's upbringing, but they don't have the right to unrestricted access to their child's body. And I think that's the really important point. They must be limited in what they can do. And these are articulated both in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and equally in an international covenant on civil and political rights, which states it really quite clearly that parents have the right to direct their child. Any manifestation of the belief must be limited by its effect on other people. And here, if you're talking about cutting into the most sensitive erogenous part of another person's body, it's difficult to imagine a more personal area of the body that a person might want to have some autonomy over. I think it's also important to remember that the Jewish and Muslim cultures are not homogenous. There are many people, and there's growing movements within both those organisations moving towards non-cutting welcome ceremonies. Some of my own relatives have done that. I come from a cutting culture myself, and some of my relatives do now welcome their children without cutting their bodies. And I think it's really also important to know that, having spoken to some people in the community, and there are many who work with us on it, many, we don't know how many, would feel hugely supported were the world and this country, all countries, move towards sort of moving away from male circumcision and say, thank goodness I don't have to cut my child's body, because the peer pressure and the pressure upon people is enormous. And I know many people who regret having done it, having given it much thought later on. So I think it's really important to remember that we don't just listen to the religious leaders. As Nazir Afzal said very eloquently in the Bradlaugh lecture a few months ago, why should we be listening to the religious leaders who are often male, self-appointed, and don't necessarily represent the communities they're talking about?
Very interesting, thanks. So moving on from these religious arguments we're hearing, there've also been sort of arguments made in favour of male circumcision from a health point of view. So the World Health Organization actually recommends male circumcision for health reasons. Can you tell us a bit about the evidence behind that?
I'm aware I've spoken a bit. I don't know if Kira wants to come in. I'm more than happy to.
I think you can take this one, Anthony. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I won't labour this too much, because the World Health Organization recommendation is focused on adult consenting men in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a high prevalence of HIV. The studies on which they base this recommendation are contentious for very good reasons. They're actually funded by the United States, not a problem in itself, but it's intriguing that a country with the highest rates of routine circumcision would fund such studies to look at circumcision as a preventative measure of female to male adult heterosexual transmission. And now in two of the countries where the studies took place about 15 years ago, homosexual sex was actually illegal at the time. So it's quite difficult to interpret, perhaps that some of the studies were stopped early. The men who were circumcised were given condoms and regular visits with doctors, whereas the others weren't. So there was rather a large amount of bias. But even setting all that aside, and if you accept these studies at face value, you're left with a procedure on sexually active adult men who are consenting. Well, that's not what INDOCA is all about. We're not weighing in against the World Health Organization. We're talking about children who are not yet sexually active, who are not yet able to give consent. Wherever people live in the world, there are now good treatments for HIV, not everywhere in the world, obviously, but using condoms to prevent HIV transmission. So the whole idea that you cut a child's genitals for therapeutic reasons, for heterosexual sexual transmission, makes no sense from a medical point of view. There is no evidence for it. And from an ethical point of view, the idea that you should presume someone's later sexuality is really quite problematic.
We do have lots of questions now coming into the Q&A, which is fantastic, some really interesting ones. So before I put it to get some of the questions on the floor, I've just got one final question. Looking forward, what do you think is the best way that we can bring an end to non-consensual genital cutting in all its forms?
Well, maybe I can speak to this a little bit. You know, I'm not sure I would say that there is one best way, and I really want to highlight that there are children's rights advocates all over the world that are doing whatever they can do within the scope of their abilities to raise awareness in their communities, online. And really, we know that the law doesn't shape society. Society shapes the law. So we do need that shift in understanding, you know, amongst our communities. First, we need that to happen. And I really am grateful to all of the people out there who are doing what they can do. You don't need to be a doctor or a lawyer or a nurse to make a difference, you know, in this issue. You just need to spread the word. But I think that what we are trying to do at this point is just raise awareness that it really isn't necessary. It should be unnecessary to ban male circumcision when really all that is required is that any specially exempt status is removed. So by that, I mean that we need to have a gender and cultural neutral, consistent application of already accepted principles. And Anthony has talked a little bit about that already. So really using existing legislation in every country would be ideal rather than a specific ban. I think that we've seen that time and again. At any time, you know, people have sought to have a ban, it doesn't go over well. So really just trying to use existing principles, removing any exempt status, I feel like that would be the best way in terms of the legislation pieces of all of this. I hope that's a good answer. Anthony, did you want to add something in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I'd echo that entirely. I think often people use the word ban, and that changes the mindset. It makes people think we're asking for something extraordinary. Rather, what's happening is quite extraordinary, and there are unique exemptions granted at the moment. So I'd echo that, and I'd also echo, you know, that Ngotka is but one tiny cog. There are many organisations and you know, major organisations as well, even, you know, recognising that this is a serious issue. And if I just go back to what Ngotka is actually, what we're aiming to do, I think, because that might just, because I didn't quite finish that bit, and it might be, I won't go into great detail, that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child examine each country's compliance with the Convention on a rolling programme. And what we're here to do is to support individual activists from each country to submit a report when that rolling review takes place. So they can submit one without us, obviously, but some people don't know where to start. So we're developing an expertise. We don't have much expertise as yet, but we have submitted some, and certainly Kira in Canada has submitted one, we've submitted in the UK. But it's to support people to do that, to raise awareness, to get it up the agenda. And ultimately, what we'd really like is for the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to come up with a general comment on childhood genital cutting that encompasses all children, which would mean that they would examine it each time they examine a country. Whereas at the moment it's quite ad hoc. If it's raised, they'll discuss it, and they have certain general comments about, you know, corporal punishment and other things, and you know, there's all sorts. So that would be our ultimate aim. But in the short term, and the other thing that we really recommend is just raise awareness, speak about it, speak to your parliamentarians, politicians, write to the papers. We know there's a large public groundswell of support for the increasing awareness of child rights. It's the politicians who haven't really got the will yet to challenge it's largely the religious elders who are placing difficulties in the way of the child safeguarding.
Absolutely. I would just like to add myself to that. If you do want to help raise awareness, on our website, there is a campaign page on genital cutting with a pre-written letter to MPs that you can send to your MP to talk more about this issue. It is such a misunderstood issue, so please do help if you can. Right, well, I think now we'll go on to some of the questions. We've had lots in the Q&A, so I'll try and get through as many as I can. Firstly, from Aaron Darkwood. Is the child the property of the parents of which they can do what they want? I mean, it's a good question. Parents get to decide lots of things for their children. So why should they be prevented from cutting their genitals?
Mm-hmm. It is a good question. My answer to that would be a child is not the property of the parents. Parents are guardians of children, and it's our responsibility to safeguard them and to care for them and to raise them. And in a situation where we're talking about genital cutting, we're talking about removing healthy, functional tissue. And there is no medical indication for that to be done at all. So, we get into disagreements about making changes to dogs, for example. We've just gotten a dog recently. And so I'm starting to hear things like this, cropping their tails and cropping their ears. And there's lots of debate about that. And yet people often just don't have a second thought about cutting an extremely sensitive part off of their newborn child's penis off. And so it's really interesting to me that contrast there. Sometimes it seems like animals might even have more rights than baby boys. But yeah, excellent question. Anthony, did you want to add something in there?
Well, the only thing I want to add is just, I work primarily as a GP in the UK, and we have quite regular and quite strict training on safeguarding children and adults. And in terms of property, absolutely not. The reality is that parents have rights to raise the children to certain degrees, but I would be struck off as a doctor if I didn't raise very serious concerns with all forms of harm. The example I give is that I once saw a young baby with a small injury to the little finger, but the baby wasn't yet mobile, and the mother couldn't give an adequate explanation initially. And I had to, I raised it as a safeguarding issue. And when you compare that to a child being brought in with a significant injury to their penis, where most people go, oh well, but that's okay, the parents chose to do it. We take safeguarding very seriously, except, and I think when people start to look at this, you see that it is really unique. There is a complete blind spot in this one area. So no, parents don't own their children, and children will often share their parents' views and beliefs later on, but quite often they won't. And repeated social attitude surveys show just how much the increasing divergence there is to children following their parents' beliefs.
Right, I hope that answers your question, Aaron. So moving on, there's still lots of very interesting questions here. We've got an anonymous question. The recent UK government decision to ban hymenoplasty was brought about in part through advocacy undertaken by charities run by and representing the communities in which the practice occurred. Could you speak more about the role of these groups in challenging male circumcision in general, if they exist, and whether you worked with them on the report? Really good question there.
Well, as it's UK, I'll speak to that. No,
you might need to explain them hymenoplasty as well for anyone who this is a new term for.
Well, again, I'm no expert on it, but it's my understanding is that it is a repair of the hymen, which is the membrane at the front of the vagina, to approximate a virgin, basically, to make sure that women appear virginal when they get married. And there are many reasons for the hymen breaking before first sexual intercourse. And it's another form of the idea that women should be pure is part of the problem, part of the patriarchal problem that Kira articulated so well earlier on today. This divergence between the way we view men and women. I don't have much more detail than that, but so I'm sorry, but no, we didn't work with them on that, and I don't know whether they are working with us. There are advocacy groups in the UK one of them 15 square, another one Men Do Complain, largely because the number of times we are told, I've never heard a man complain about it. Both very good advocacy organisations in the UK on the subject, as is the National Secular Society, I must add.
Oh, thank you. Yes, and we've worked a little bit with Men Do Complain as well. Okay, so going on to the next question, another interesting one from Ian Pickvance. Do the panel think that historically cutting both males and females was something proscribed by men, priests and the like, and was more about control of sexual urges and pleasure than any command by God or gods? And if the population of religious leaders had been predominantly female, would cutting be as widespread?
That's a fabulous question. Wow. I think maybe the challenge with the question that I'm having a little bit is that piece at the beginning about, do we think that this was sort of a command issued by the male religious leaders or something that came from God? I think that the question assumes that there is a God. So I have a little bit of a challenge with that one. I personally, I'm not a religious person, and so I feel like I'm in good company here. And I think that, yes, it very likely would have been a different story if the religious leaders had been women. We hear story after story after story of mothers, of women who have felt coerced, who have felt pressured, who have felt extremely, forced into making that decision to circumcise their newborn sons in North America. That's a very common refrain. They're referred to as regret mothers, and of course there are fathers too who tie into that category, but it is often women. And some of the most active genital autonomy advocates in North America are women who went through that pain of feeling forced to circumcise their babies, and then later discovering, that there was no medical reason for it, and just being devastated by that. So I do think that there is something to that idea, that maybe all of this might have been very different. Of course, we'll never really know. Anthony, did you want to speak to that a little bit about the religious aspect? I'm not an expert in this.
I'm not sure anyone is. There's quite a. I mean, again, I totally agree. Excellent question, but I must admit, I'm certainly not an expert on the history of it. The best paper I ever read was a Nobel laureate from America who wrote a paper about the history of male and female genital cutting around the world. It's a fantastic paper that really talked about how it looks from the outside, if you look at all the different practices around the world. So this is just one interpretation. It was his interpretation, and he was a Jewish Nobel laureate, actually, who wrote this. It looked as if by the male version of cutting tries to make the penis more rod-like and non-female, and the female version by tries to make it more female by cutting off all extraneous bits. I mean, that's very simplification of his discussion and argument. In terms of would it have been different if women had done it, I'm sure it would have been different. How different, we'll never know. The history of sexual violence against women is awful. I'll stop there because we just don't know.
Great, thanks. So moving swiftly on to the next question from Rob Nicholson. Is it acceptable to promote safer male genital cutting as a first step rather than by non-medical religious specialists, or should this also be opposed?
Should I lead with that one?
Yes, that sounds good. Yeah.
I mean, this is a very interesting question, and there are certainly some people who oppose genital cutting who would actually advocate for this as a first step. Again, I offer you a thought experiment, and I think it's not even an experiment, because in America in 2012, the Bioethics Committee of the American Academy of Pediatricians actually recommended medicalizing a version of FGM, a ritual nick in the hood of the clitoris, the female equivalent of the foreskin, to try to minimize harm. This was it met with a furious response, and they withdrew this suggestion within a few weeks. In truth, if we go back to the basics, imagine a child who's had a medicalized circumcision, because society thinks that's better than it happening under the radar. He's still lost a major part of his anatomy. He still has no opportunity to regrow it. So there is a debate to be had about it, but I think it's a problematic debate if you bring it into the fold. And I think it's interesting. The arguments often made to medicalise are by those who want to. And in fact, the arguments to medicalise FGM are often made by those who recognise the current disparity and realise there has to be some compromise found unless both are to be stopped. And I suppose my and Gotker's option is to say, look, these are basic principles. Let's keep to them. There should be no compromise. I can't see a reason to bring any harmful practice into medicine. And certainly as a doctor, I already, funny enough, have on our website a conscientious objection to cutting children's healthy genitals, because the GMC advises me to do so.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting. That you have that conscientious objection.
Yeah.
Cool. It's very
and nurses actually can do the same thing. They can become conscientious objectors to assisting with circumcisions as well. And there is an organization called Nurses for the Rights of the Child. It's an American-based organization, but the information that they provide and the support they provide is international. So certainly if there's any nurses joining us, please do check that out, Nurses for the Rights of the Child. I did want to just add one little piece that, when we talk about shifting circumcision to be done under medical supervision, minimizing the harm, unfortunately, there is no guarantee that having a circumcision performed in a hospital is going to minimize the harm. We hear of accidents happening all the time. Some of them are reported, often they are not. We not long ago had a baby boy in Canada that bled to death after being circumcised in the hospital. Completely avoidable, completely preventable. There's a significant number of circumcisions done in the hospital setting or a clinical setting that are not done with any sort of anesthetic at all. So I really feel like it's a slippery slope when we start getting into, that idea of minimizing the harm, because there really isn't any guarantee of some of those basic pieces that you would imagine being in place. There's no guarantee of them being there, sadly.
Yeah, that's really sad, isn't it, that happens. I remember earlier you were struggling for a name. George Wald, Brian Earp has said. That's the name of the author there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so next question from Peter Hayden. Has there ever been a case where a circumcised man has sued his parents for assault? And would such a case in the UK be successful and outlaw the practice?
I'll answer that if I may, because it was there was a case where he didn't sue his parents, he was trying to sue his doctor. And this was a case, it was about 10 years ago, that's actually over 10 years ago. And I actually became involved in the case because I was asked to refer him to a urologist because he felt he couldn't go to his own GP, who wouldn't have supported him in this. And what was intriguing about that case was that I referred him to a urologist, and the urologist is actually Gordon Muir, who's written some excellent papers on this, and who is certainly on the side of the gods, if I may, on this subject. Although he's scrupulously academic and he's not a part of any sort of movement as such. He's just very open and honest. He's recently written a very good paper on the fact that there are no medical benefits for and it really shouldn't take place, and that was published within last year. What I want to say though is that this supportive urologist dissuaded this young man who was I think he was 19 at the time, and he dissuaded him on the grounds that yes, he had a sinus, that's a hole in his penis. He had pain every time he weed. He had a bend on the penis and a pain every time he had an erection. But he dissuaded him because Gordon Muir said these side effects are common. He sees them commonly, and therefore a claim of medical negligence wouldn't succeed. And that's really stuck with me because, there's a urologist. I've since spoken to a plastic surgeon who, when I spoke out once at a GMC meeting, she said, oh my gosh, yes, I've seen lots of children. So interestingly, there is, in terms of has there been, I think that's the only one I'm aware of. The difficulty is the timescales of it, because you can sue people, I think, up to 3 years after you turn 18, but most people don't have the wherewithal or the understanding or funds or the support to do that at such an early age. So it is difficult. I'll very briefly just say that there's hope for the future, and certainly Duncker has identified some hope for the future in terms of there's a new protocol, I won't go into great detail, of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which allows individual people to submit a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child after they've exhausted all local remedies. And I think that may well encourage more people in the future to challenge things within their own jurisdiction. And once it's gone to the highest court in that land, they will then have the opportunity to go to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, who have not yet examined such a case. Well, they examined a case, but it was dismissed on technical reasons. And in fact, we submitted to that as a third party. Many thanks to Stephen Svoboda, who is actually here on the call as well, and who was prepared a fantastic paper to submit as well.
Thank you. I've got two questions here that I wonder if they could be combined slightly, because they're both about sort of the harms. So Alison Wren's asking, what research has been done on the damage to the male sensation of removing the prepuce? Anecdotally, it appears that removal deadens sexual sensation. And Ryan Thomas asks, he says, there's lots of talk about the physical damage caused by MGM or FGM, but there is also significant psychological harm. How advanced is the discussion about this aspect of damage in advocating for genital autonomy and addressing the long-lasting harm caused?
Those are excellent questions. Anthony, I'll probably let you handle the question on the function, the sexual function. I just wanted to maybe touch on there is increasingly more and more research being done on the psychological aspect of the impacts of circumcision, male circumcision. We've seen the global study, the global survey of circumcision harm was recently published, and that has been, an excellent look into this issue. And I think it's, we're just sort of scratching the surface, really. For so many years, this has been brushed under the table. No one's wanted to talk about it. And again, I think this all goes back to that idea of, men, just man up. You hear that phrase, right? And this ties right into that. Men don't really want to discuss this, or men feel like they shouldn't discuss it. Maybe they do want to, but there's this societal view, this pressure on them. No, don't talk about it, you're fine. So I think we need a lot more discussion about it. I think that it needs to be much better accepted within the medical community. Physicians and nurses, we need to not be dismissive of these issues, because they are very real, and they can be devastating for many men. They really can. In Canada, we've had a number of young men approach the national organization here in Canada, wanting to know what they can do, what recourse they have, and their primary complaint following the sexual harms has always been the psychological damage, the trauma that they feel about it, the depression, the anxiety, significant mental health concerns. And I think that we're going to see more and more research and more discourse about that in the literature going forward. I'll pass it over to you, Anthony.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Kira. And certainly in the UK, there's 15 Square, I know, have taken a keen interest in the psychological element and the harms, because they get so many calls from distressed men, and I know they've organised sessions, and I know they'd be more than happy to hear from people about that. In terms of the sexual harms, it's interesting, because it's very interesting when people make broad claims, which the advocates of circumcision often do, so I won't do the same. In truth, if you remove the foreskin, you're removing a part of the body that can no longer be touched, can no longer play any part in sexual activity. So it's an intrinsic sexual harm in itself, because we know that many men enjoy touching, rolling the foreskin itself. In terms of the actual harms, the evidence of harms, again, it's tricky, because we're talking about removing a sexual organ from someone before they're sexually active. So it's quite difficult to compare apples with oranges. And often some of the studies that claim there's no problem, actually, they look at men who've had circumcision as adults for a medical problem and say, well, they felt a lot better. So, but either way, the jury's out on that. But there are some good studies, and there was a study called Fine Touch Pressure Thresholds in the Adult Penis, and that looked at and it basically showed that the foreskin was the most sensitive part of the penis. That's not about sexual activity, but it was about fine touch. And there was some Danish research as well showing that circumcised men had more difficulty with orgasm, and certainly the women in the study had difficulties themselves, more pain and less ability to achieve orgasm as well. As I say, there's a lot of debate about it, and the research is difficult to do, but it stands to reason if you remove a part of someone's sexual organ, it's going to affect them functionally, but it's also psychological. And as we all know, sex is not just in the body. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just going through the questions, I saw an interesting comment from Daniel Stranjord. In Egypt, for example, the medicalization of FGM actually increased the severity of the cutting in many cases because people thought it was safer when a doctor was doing it instead of a non-medical person. So thanks for that comment, Daniel. I'm sorry if I got your name wrong there. And thank you for that comment. That's really interesting. I've noted there's been several questions which have, lots of people are asking, why are you referring to genital cutting as opposed to genital mutilation? Lots of people are really questioning this. Would either of you be able to answer that?
Sure, yeah, I can speak a little bit to it, and maybe Anthony can jump in too. But I remember when I first got started, being involved in this whole issue and learning about it and speaking about it. And at that time, I absolutely used that term, mutilation, male genital mutilation, because in my mind, that's what it is. But after a few years and a lot of learning, internet chat forums and debates and trying to help parents, wrestling with this decision, I came to realize that the term did more harm than good, that term mutilation, because it is extremely polarizing. It sets people up to be either extremely defensive, if maybe that was something that was done to them and they have not yet sort of come to terms with that. It can just shut, constructive discussion right down before you've even had a chance to get into it. But then another piece that I learned along the way is that women in communities where female genital cutting is practiced, who do that practice themselves, they are the ritual cutters. They took great issue also with that term mutilation, and they were pushing back against it as well, saying, this is not mutilation. We feel that this beautifies the female body, and they, had a big problem with the term as well. So it seems to be problematic no matter which way you go at it. So there has been a shift, I think, within the discourse to adopting this more sort of universal term of genital cutting, because it is applicable whether we're looking at males, at intersex people, at females, and it is a little bit more neutral in terms of the tone, and it doesn't minimize what actually is being done, but it can help in terms of setting up the discourse to be a little bit more collaborative, hopefully. Anthony?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. What it does by not using terms that are, in my view, unhelpful, is it helps to bring communities with us. The parallel is that some people call male cutting male genital mutilation, and immediately many people from the cutting communities close their ears. If you talk about genital cutting, they still struggle sometimes, but it's much easier to start to have a dialogue, because that's exactly what it is. It's genital cutting. I think it's also important to remember that female genital mutilation and male circumcision are two ends of a nomenclature scale. And if you remember that FGM used to be known as female circumcision until people said, why are we using this euphemism? Why don't we call it what it is? And certainly in Ngotka, we prefer to call it what it is as childhood genital cutting, because that's what it is. It's a descriptive term, and we'd like it to stop. And to be honest, the best way to get it to stop is to engage people and to engage the communities that do cut, because we know there are many people who support us from within those communities. And the last thing we want to do is push people away who might otherwise join us if they weren't immediately sort of taking 3 steps backwards hearing us speak. I want to be welcoming and open to people who are willing to sort of work within their communities. And we certainly do work with people within the communities, very much so.
Thank you. We are sort of heading towards the end of the discussion. However, there are so many questions. I would like to add this one. It's an anonymous, Donald Ernest Patter. This is a very interesting one from him. It sounds like a bit of a real life situation here. Despite having a fairly good relationship with the leaders of a children's home in Kenya, I know that I would be on very shaky ground if I suggested that adolescent circumcision should cease, and I would lose all credibility. Where to start in a culture where the practice is so deeply ingrained and supported by politics and religion?
That sounds like a tremendous challenge. What I can share is an example that has been going on in North America within the Jewish community. And I think that the change that comes from within is always going to be the most successful, the most easily adopted, the quickest. And we see that within the Jewish community in the United States, where we have an organization called Beyond the Bris. And I really want to highlight the work that these folks have been doing, because I think it's been absolutely pivotal. It's really making a tremendous difference. And I want to just give a wee bit of background. Essentially, and again, this is my very limited understanding, so forgive me if I make any mistakes, but essentially there is an alternate ceremony to the typical bris, and it's called bris shalom, which is a gentle welcome. And it's a ceremony where there's no cutting involved. And it's my understanding that it's a ceremony that can also be offered for girls that are being welcomed by Jewish parents as well as boys. So it's more inclusive in that sense as well. And so this ceremony is happening now in the United States, but also around the world. And obviously the numbers, I'm sure, are very small, admittedly, but it has to start somewhere. And I just think that it's wonderful to see things like this happen. So they're proposing an alternate to the ritual. They're not saying we need to just get rid of this completely, because obviously there's an understanding that it is significant. Welcoming a new member into the community, into the family, this is very meaningful. And so they're recognizing that. They're recognizing the underpinnings of it, right? So they're just finding a way to create something else that is equally meaningful, but doesn't carry with it those intrinsic harms of the cutting. So I would say if there's a way to model an effort, where you are in Kenya after something like the work that they're doing at Beyond the Bris, obviously there would have to be some dramatic differences. We're talking about the difference between babies and teenagers and different cultures completely. But I think it's worth taking a look at, because that change from within is very powerful and it seems to be very effective. Anthony?
Yeah, and I agree. It sounds like an enormous challenge, and I alluded to the fact that I come myself from a cutting culture, and for me, keep the conversation going, and go back to first principles. I think is for me what's really important. We have universal child safeguarding principles, and if you can talk about it in a non-judgmental way, as much as possible. It can be really hard to do that, because often you'll meet a defensive wall and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. But for me, it's about keeping the conversation going and not being, certainly for me, not being scared of being the sore thumb. I've spoken, all my relatives know what I do in this regard. Certainly some of them don't speak to me, but some of them do and are very supportive. And I think that's all I can say really, is keep the conversation going and be open to it, because you're not going to change it overnight. None of us are, although that would be a fantastic success. And I suppose I always go back. I went to a talk once by the Finnish Ombudsman of the Children. I'm just going to interject here because it just reminded me of things changing overnight. And he was giving a talk at a genital autonomy conference, and he started by saying 1984, and we didn't know what he was talking about. We thought he might be talking about George Orwell. But actually what he was saying was in 1984, Finland didn't have a law against smacking children. Nobody was ready for it. He said, well, we've got to wait, we've got to build it in. Oh, let's have a trial and introduce it. And he was giving his talk about 5 or 6 years ago. And he said, well, nobody smacks their children now because the trial is still ongoing. So sometimes change can happen overnight when there's enough groundswell. The only way that's going to happen is if it goes right to the top of the public agenda and people keep talking about it and people are aware that it is actually a problem. Because to be fair, a lot of people realise that it is fundamentally a problem. It's just justified by all sorts of recourse to other reasons.
Wonderful, thank you. I think that's on that sort of fairly hopeful note, that's a good place to stop. We did have a lot more questions, and I am so sorry if we haven't been able to get round to your question. We did have an awful lot, as I thought we might do for this event. So thank you so much for joining us, Anthony and Kira. It's been a really fascinating talk. I think, and thanks everyone for their questions as well. I think between us all, we've managed to really share a lot about this very complex and sensitive issue. So thank you so much for being a part of the discussion. Please do feel free to get in touch with the NSS. If you have any other questions you'd like to ask, just send us an email. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you at a future NSS talk soon. Have a good evening.